it's not just creating a humanitarian crisis where you've got 10 million people here illegally, for example, maybe, in that range.
I think 7 million over the last 2 years.
Yeah. Biden opened up the borders when he became president.
It's crazy.
No doubt about it. And I say this tongue in cheek, but it's harder to get into a BYU football game than it is to get across the border right now.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the 435 podcast. I'm your host, Robert McFarland. I have Jeff Watkins riding shotgun with me today as we interviewed Brad Wilson. He is running for the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Mitt Romney. We talked to him about a lot of different stuff. We talked about immigration. We talked about budget. He's a finance guy. We talked a lot about money. We talked about international trade. We talked about how the state legislature is different from the federal government and how that impacts Washington County, whether it's federal lands. We talked about water. We went down a long journey here. We hope you get a lot of information about him, his candidacy, and why you should elect him if you choose. It's go to electbradwilson.com to find out more information about him. Make sure you hit like or subscribe so that we know that you're following and you enjoy what you're seeing. And we want to make sure we say thank you to all our sponsors and supporters because we're coming up on a year and it's been a fun ride. We want to keep it going. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy this episode. We'll see you out there. Born in Layton.
Yep.
Raised in Kaysville.
Layton and Kaysville.
Okay, went to college at Weber State.
Yep.
Way to go.
Yep.
Not BYU, which
Correct.
I thought was very interesting.
Right.
Don't ask me why I think that's interesting, but I think that's interesting. You have done multiple businesses, financial advising,
Correct.
I guess.
Planning, advising, yep.
Advising, some development, building.
Yep. Construction, development, yep.
Construction and development. You got into the state legislature in 2011.
Correct.
And then you were Speaker of the House, the most previous Speaker of the House for 5 years. And at this stage, now you're just making your jump to the Senate seat, to the U.S. Senate seat, vacated by Mitt Romney, right?
Correct. You got it.
What else? Oh, you got 3 kids?
Yep.
3 kids.
It's very impressive, Robert.
What? I just researched. I researched it this morning. Thinking about your history and your past, what drove you to politics? Mm-hmm. What was it about, was it business that...
Yeah, it was business. It was business and some frustration with government, actually, from a business standpoint, and also just knowing that these jobs matter for our communities and wanting to make a difference.
And by jobs, what jobs? What do you mean?
Well, the reason that I jumped in, we're still pre-doing the...
I think we could keep going. I'm good. I do an intro at the end, so we can keep. So we can keep talking.
We're doing this.
We're rolling.
Well, the reason that I ran in 2010, took office in 2011, was it's kind of an interesting story, actually. So I just finished being the Chamber of Commerce chair of the board, and I did that really because I thought that I'd been lucky and fortunate in my business and wanted to represent and kind of just help make things good for other business owners. And I'd gone back to my business. I was sitting in my office on a Thursday morning. The phone rang, and it was some folks saying, "Brad, the person that's had the legislative seat in the House from your area is not running for re-election. Tomorrow is the filing deadline. Will you run? We think you'd be good." And I'd had some frustrations with government getting in the way of my business and thought this is maybe an opportunity for me to go and fix some things. And so and also to represent our community. And there'd been some other things happening that made me feel like, I think I could do a good job down at the state capitol. But the truth is I'd hardly ever thought about ever being in politics. In fact, my dad was in politics for a lot of his career, and I purposefully said, I don't ever want to get in politics. But I ended up running and winning.
Okay.
And really enjoyed that experience of serving the state and serving my community. Felt like I made a difference and ended up, there's more to the story here, but one of the things that was a little surprising is I, as a business person, I ended up getting asked by the Speaker of the House, then Becky Lockhart, at the end of my freshman term the next year to join her leadership team, which was a little unprecedented at the time for someone that new in the legislature to be part of the leadership team of the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And so that happened, and I ended up being part of the budget committee chairmanship.
Okay.
And that started my career in legislative leadership.
Yeah.
And ultimately ended up me being Speaker of the House because of that.
Do you think part of that had to do with, I'm assuming it's because you just showed some automatic leadership once you got into the state, but your financial background, did that have some piece to it?
There's a lot of attorneys in politics.
Right. There are.
But I think that having someone with a business background,
mm-hmm.
especially this was in 2010, 2011,
yeah,
and coming from the real estate market, right, and construction, having just gone through that crucible of very difficult times and having someone with that perspective, I think was part of the reason why I ended up sort of rising fast through the ranks. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of different reasons. But that experience, and I really understood the state budget, mm-hmm. and I was really committed to trying to find ways to make the budget lean, mm-hmm. and ultimately ended up with tax cuts and how do we figure that out. And that's one of my proudest achievements actually as Speaker of the House, is the biggest tax cuts in the history of the state while I was Speaker, well over $1 billion, including 3 income tax cuts, major income tax cuts for seniors on Social Security, eliminating taxes for veterans in the state of Utah for state taxes. These things are all reflections of our values as a community. Mm-hmm. And I knew that if we cut taxes, we would, A, be keeping money in people's pockets and help them fight all this crazy inflation that Joe Biden's given us. Mm-hmm. But B, it's how way you constrain growth in government.
Yeah.
If you don't give government more money, it doesn't grow more.
That's right.
And part of the secret sauce in Utah is we still believe in small government and low taxes.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's a little bit of that story there in terms of how my business experience translated into lawmaking and setting policy for the state.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great transition into, because we think of the state issues, and then now you're getting into a seat that's the national issues, right? You're going up the chain. And I think the design, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the design is more focused, and I would use the term big government at the local level, but I mean like local government is going to have more control. And then as it goes to the state level, there's a little less control. And then at the federal level, there's even less control, right? Yep. So thinking about how I think over the last 100 years, we've flipped that over where the federal government has a ton of control and then the local governments are losing, more and more control. And I know locally, there's a lot of people that feel frustrated with even some of the one size fits all solutions coming from Salt Lake, because St. George and Washington County, we're a little bit of an island where, we're unique in that what is good for, Utah County is definitely not necessarily the same solution strategies for Washington County.
100%, actually. The government that's the local level is the government that matters or should matter the most to us. And it's a great example of how we've lost our way in Washington, that these things that Washington is doing to us they were never intended to be powers given to Washington. Yeah. And they're failing in so many different ways. But we've got to turn that back. One of the really unique things about my candidacy for the Senate is no one has the same perspective of being Speaker of the House and having a front row seat to how important it is that the federal government stays inside its lane. The amount of resources and time and brain damage that we spend in this state because the federal government is doing stuff to us that it shouldn't do and not doing things it should do is remarkable.
Brain damage is such a great describer. Yeah. Brain damage.
And even the dollars that we spend fixing things the federal government has been negligent on is really something that citizens of the state, I'm not sure they even at times have line of sight to, but
when you start talking about the number of zeros, though, like when you really think like $1 trillion is 12 zeros, most people can't conceptualize what that actually means. Like there's a few like video graphics that you can put together that help, but I think still to this day, you hear those big numbers and they're just oblivious to it.
Well, yeah, and there's $34 trillion of debt that are being put upon our kids and our grandkids right now.
Yeah, it's an invisible tax. I mean, inflation and that debt is an it's an unelected tax. It's a tax that we are all going to have to pay. And how we do that, though, is going to be, there's a thousand ways to slice that up, but ultimately we can't just keep ignoring it, right? So what do you think, if you could, obviously you can't wave your wand and just say, hey, this is going to fix it, but where do you think are practical steps of starting to chip away, not only at that deficit, but also, at that federal level? Where do you think some of these cuts should come from, maybe first or second, or what do you think? There's a real strategy there?
Well, there has to be. You've got to change the system back there. The fact that there's no mechanism that requires the federal government to balance their budget is insane to me. It's crazy to me. And we've got to have a balanced budget amendment or something back there that requires that to happen. And you have so few people that have experience back there balancing a budget for government and also business experience. And that's one of the things that I think I'm at an advantage of bringing back there. But with that all being said, once you change the system, once you say, yeah, you've got to balance the budget, you'll see very different behaviors. You'll start to see hard decisions being made. You'll also see less printing of money, creating this inflation that's hurting Utah families. And there's so many ways to cut spending in this country. There's so much waste in government spending. The other thing that you would see differently is you'd start to see finally the federal government saying, wait, this actually isn't our job. Why are we even doing this? The fact that we have a Department of Education at the federal level is insanity to me. That is not a responsibility that the federal government has. It's very clear it doesn't have that responsibility. Yet we've given them power. They have influence in our education system. And listen, I'm all for a strong education system. But we've talked at the beginning of this conversation about that's something that should be done at a local level. You have the school district here in Washington County. That's their job. Yeah. Federal government doesn't have a responsibility there.
Well, part of me thinks like the idea behind the Department of Education, when it was the inception of it, I think there was a lot of great arguments for having some kind of oversight in the amount of money that we could flood into different areas, right? There's a disparity between one area to the next with education, even financially, their ability, right? Some schools literally get issued, the kids get iPads. All of them, that's part of their, that's just part of their, it's not like they get books anymore. They get an actual iPad in some schools versus others that are dealing with old, outdated textbooks, right? So I can see how there's some of this element of it seemed good at the time, but when it's not working anymore, it seems almost impossible for the federal government to be like, hey, we made a mistake. We tried. This seemed like a good idea at the start, but now it's almost like they just keep throwing money at it to try to solve the problem, and they can never really turn it around. Why do you think this balanced budget approach or requirement hasn't passed up to this point?
Well, lack of political courage. I mean, plain and simple. There's not enough people back in Washington that are serious enough about their jobs to make a difference and leave the place a better place than they found it. And until we elect people in Washington that are going to take a different approach, we're going to get the same outcomes. And if we want different outcomes in Washington, we need to elect different people. Yeah. And think about what we're doing to our kids and our grandkids. I mean, you talk about this invisible tax, but my generation, we didn't get any kind of debt foisted upon us like we're giving to the next generation. And it's astounding to me that we're doing this and no one's talking about it. So we've got to fix it. We've got to go back and have someone that's going to help lead the charge. One of the things that's interesting, the U.S. Senate is the great equalizer in American politics. California has 53 members of the House. Utah has 4. California has 2 U.S. senators. So does Utah. Yeah. This election has serious consequence for our state. And we've got to make sure that we elect someone that's going to go back and represent Utah's values. It's going to do the heavy lifting, that's going to be a rock-ribbed Republican, because this is going to be a Republican seat. We know this. This is
Right.
Utah.
Right. Still is. Yep.
And
Still Utah.
we're going to elect a Republican.
Yep.
The question is, what kind of Republican? And I believe
There's a lot of definitions these days
there is
for Republicans.
Yeah, and Utah will decide what kind of Republican they're going to send back there.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm telling people, what my message is, if you want to elect someone that's a conservative fighter, that's got a track record of bringing conservative outcomes into public policy, into this state, and what I hear over and over again is, Brad, could you go make Washington look more like Utah, where you balance your budget, where you've cut taxes consistently year after year, where you've constrained government spending, where you actually believe in the Second Amendment and pass constitutional carry. And, the list of things goes on and on. Those are the kinds of things people want to elect someone to Washington in our U.S. Senate seat to go back and do. And I think they also feel at this time, for a lot of different reasons, that they want someone that has a very consistent track record, that has represented conservative values their whole life. I've been involved in conservative politics since I was a teenager.
How would you? I have a hard time getting people to answer this, or at least that there's not like an agreed upon. What are conservative values? Like, what would you give?
Yeah.
What are like 3-4 conservative values?
I'll tell
maybe.
you, sure. We're an outlier in Utah. We are still a state, and I think conservative values, at least the Utah way, is we believe in hard work still.
Okay.
We believe in personal responsibility, not government handouts. We want low taxes. We want small government. We believe in the family. It's a cornerstone of society, and we're going to do everything we can to protect it. Those are some examples of conservative values.
Okay.
And look at that list and compare that list to California.
Yeah.
Compare that.
I try not to compare. I came from California in 2015. My wife and I moved here. She was born and raised there. I was born up in Sandy. And so I lived a little bit of my life up in Salt Lake and a little in New Mexico and a little in California. And now we moved here in 2015. And yeah, it's a night and day difference. I mean, the way from the politics to the culture, right? Yeah. It's completely different.
But think about what I said, just, kind of at the beginning of that list of hard work and personal responsibility.
Yeah.
There are places in this country right now, both at a state level and the federal government, where people are better off not working and getting a government handout than they are going out and getting a job.
Yeah.
And there are political leaders that are okay with that and have enabled that to happen. That is not the way we do things in Utah.
Yeah.
And how do we get more of that into DC?
Yeah. I think too, we end up at the political level, it's a game. A lot of times the politicians end up playing the game rather than go to solve the problems. I'll use immigration, and I didn't want to necessarily bring up immigration, but hearing the Republicans not support any bill moving forward specifically, and this is just from what I've heard in multiple news sources, is that they don't want to give the Biden administration the win heading into the election of saying we pass some kind of immigration policy to change what's happening down there. And when I hear that, I can't help but think, are we so blinded by the partisan politics, so blinded by the game, that we're not actually just trying to solve the problems? Yeah. It's so frustrating to me to see that happen.
Well, I hope that's not the case. I hope we solve the problem. And here's why. Your bill, your share of the bill right now, and my share of the bill is probably $2,000 to $3,000, maybe more, at a state, local, and federal government from a budget standpoint of what our share is of the immigration crisis in this country. It's not just creating a humanitarian crisis where you've got 10 million people here illegally, for example, maybe, in that range.
I think 7 million over the last 2 years.
Yeah. Biden opened up the borders when he became president.
It's crazy.
No doubt about it. And I say this tongue in cheek, but it's harder to get into a BYU football game than it is to get across the border right now. And, but it's straining our schools. It's straining our law enforcement. It's straining our social service programs. It is having a real impact on Americans. And we are literally paying the price for this. And there's a tax on us as Americans right now because the border is open. And I think we're just at the beginning stages of this. So you've got to close the border. I think, and this is a radical thing to say, but I think sending American troops to the border to close it needs to happen sooner than later. And then we can have a conversation about what to do with legal immigration. It's an important part of our country. I'm a big believer in it. I come from construction. I know the value of immigrant labor. It matters, but not the way that it's coming now. We don't know how many of these people are terrorists. I was down here. I've been down here all week, and we had an event yesterday we were doing where we were involved law enforcement. We had to start late because they did a fentanyl bust.
Oh, wow.
Before the event here in Washington County. That's literally happening here. So that's happening in your community and our communities all across the state with fentanyl that's come across the border because the border is open.
Right. Well, and I think it was also coming across the border during the Trump administration, but the fact that they basically reversed all of any of the rules or approach that Donald Trump took, he just undid all of those things. Instead of actually having like hey, we're going to do it this way, he just said, we're just not going to do it this way. Sure. Right. And it's a way to say, I'm going to tell my party and my constituents that I undid the insanity of Donald Trump, and I can show you that I've done this thing. But then they never took any approach to fix it. And the troops, I think the troops are already headed there, right? I think almost 25 Republican states have sent some kind of National Guard support down there.
But that's not the job of the National Guard. It's the job of the federal government.
It for sure is.
And Donald Trump in 2017 or 2018, we had 200,000 people cross the border. 200,000 people illegally. That's too many, right? But that's 2.5 million plus last year. So yeah, we had people crossing the border illegally when Trump was president.
Hey, Brad, I just wanted to add a story. I got a buddy. I see him every morning at the gym. He works night shift, highway patrol. So he patrols basically from the port up to the hurricane exit. And so every morning I see him, I'm like, what'd you do last night? Who'd you catch? What'd you do? A couple of days ago, he said the same thing. He said he pulled somebody over. They had $500,000 in cash in the trunk. And he didn't know off the top of his head, but he had about half a backpack's worth of fentanyl in his backpack.
Yeah.
Just one guy driving up from Southern California.
This drug bust yesterday that was proximate to the event that I was doing with Washington County sheriffs, 29 pounds of fentanyl caught in Washington County yesterday.
Yeah.
Borders open, drugs, terrorists. It's a humanitarian crisis. I mean, it's a mess. Close the border, fix legal immigration. We've got to have leaders who are going to go back and play hardball with this issue.
And I think that's an important. I think that's an important job that the federal government should be doing. Right, like when we were talking about what should the federal government doing and what shouldn't they? I think it's a stark difference between education and migration or immigration, however you want to define it. For sure, the federal government should be helping us keep the border safe, bring people here that want to be here. Because I mean, we still have the Statue of Liberty out there. You're tired, you're hungry, you're yearning to breathe free, right? There's all these people that want to come here, and I'm in Southern California working in restaurants. Majority of them, they have to have I-9 certification of like their actual citizenship, and so many of them had fake ones. They had fake IDs. They were paying taxes on whatever social security number that they got of some human somewhere else, right? They got some legal, but it's fraudulent. I can for sure tell you that most of them were not legitimate. Or before that, if they were working that job before the requirement for that, they were working and just sending money home because they had family in Mexico or wherever they came from, and they were just trying to make money to support their family, right? Yeah. They want to come here. They see opportunities here, and they were the best workers. Coming here, my wife worked in restaurants here in Southern Utah when we first moved here, and it is a night and day difference, right? Between somebody that's working to live and somebody that's just working because, mom made him get a job, right? I think there's a difference, right? We talk about like hardworking, seeing the value of that thing, and so much of the migrant population, they do want to work hard. They do want to earn their way. But then again, a lot of them do not. A lot of them do have, ulterior motives, right? And I think we got to help differentiate that. If we don't have a strong border, we can't differentiate that at all.
Well, and part of the problem too is, it might be a lot of the problem is it's not just people from Mexico that are trying to come over here. We're getting people from all over the world coming through the border. So.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, too, the A group that cares the most about getting the border problem fixed are those that have come here legally.
Yeah,
legal immigrants. They know this is setting back their cause, their effort, and so we've got to work on this for sure.
Well, so I think budget is a big thought for me. Is like, how do we drive that? Immigration's part of it. What are your thoughts on? How can, at the federal level, Washington County being an economic hub for Utah is what the goal is. I know a lot of the people here, we want to be a big economic driver for the state of Utah. How can your seat at the Senate help us achieve that goal? Because I know there's a couple of things that are limiting us. Water being a huge piece. Because without water, we can't have economic development if we can't even develop anything. So maybe help me understand what's your perspective on that. And I know Jeff, you did a better job asking the question to me, posing the question.
Well,
so if you want to change the verbiage on that.
No, I think that's it. I mean, maybe the one thing I would add would be, just kind of anecdotally, the legislature, over the years has made it pretty clear that they want St. George to be an economic hub for Utah. Obviously, we don't have the volume, the population as we do as Northern Utah, but to keep growing, how can one United States senator, it kind of maybe not earmark's not the right word, but have a little bit of a bias for St. George to say, hey, look, here's what I'm going to do specifically for the area.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and the opportunity that I see for the state of Utah is to elect someone to the Senate that really understands the different needs of the state and opportunities that exist there. And specifically for Washington County, for this area of Utah to live up to its potential, to be not just an economic powerhouse in the region, not for Utah, but an economic powerhouse for the region, as well as a place where you can live this remarkable quality of life. There are some big things that need to be addressed here.
Yeah.
Water being one of them, public lands being another, and having someone that has experience in both of those areas in the U.S. Senate is really important for Washington County and St. George. And no one in this race can hold a candle to me in terms of their understanding of water issues. I spent the last 5 years as Speaker of the House. It was the single issue I spent the most time on. And the water issues in Washington County and central Utah and northern Utah are all very different from each other.
They're all a problem. It's a problem for the whole state.
They're interrelated, but they're different. The solutions are different. And having someone in the Senate that understands this issue so well is going to really matter. Now, listen, water is not like one of those top of the list items that we see when we do polling, for example. Right. But it really, really matters. And so my experience with water and solving Southern Utah's water problems, I think will really be an advantage for me when I'm back there. And I understand the limited resources here and quite frankly, the concentrated risk that exists for Washington County with the Virgin River. And I stood up while I was Speaker of the House, and I've talked about this before. Speakers of the House never run legislation. It's just not something you do.
Right.
But I sponsored the bill creating the Colorado River Authority because I knew that in the terms of the future of the state of Utah, very few things mattered more than the Colorado River for Southern Utah.
Right.
And so I said, I want to run that bill. I'm going to make sure it passes. We're going to put everything we can into protecting Utah's ability to protect its share of the Colorado River. And it's been a remarkable success, and it's going to make a really big difference for Washington County and Southern Utah over time. But there's so many other things that need to be done. And again, if we want Washington County to live up to its potential in this region, we've got to solve the water problem on a regional level.
Yep.
We can't just think of it inside the borders of the state of Utah. And you've got to have someone back in the U.S. Senate that's going to fight to make sure that happens. And if they don't have the understanding of its importance and the complexity and the opportunity, we're not electing the right person, quite frankly.
Yeah, I completely agree, and at least from my understanding, so I had Zach Renstrom. He's a general manager for the Washington Water
Remarkable
Conservancy.
guy.
Remarkable guy. I had him on the podcast. We talked about water a lot. I interviewed Lieutenant Governor Cox at the time back in 2019, and I had him on. I hosted him on, but I had three of the big developments. The managers of the big developments. So Desert Color, Tech Ridge, and Black Desert.
Yeah.
I had them ask him questions. It all landed around water.
Yeah.
I had no idea that that's what was going to happen, but it all landed around water. And so he kind of highlighted to me, we've kind of we have a handicap, or had a handicap, in that we didn't really have a big focus on water in the Colorado River Compact, right?
Correct.
We didn't have a lot of representation. At the time, we had like 2 attorneys that were designated to be a part of understanding that and knowing that. And Colorado had like 9 or 10 different attorneys. And this was 2019. And now we're renegotiating that compact and the agreement between Colorado, Arizona, and California. And I guess, is New Mexico a part of that as well? I don't think so.
Yeah, there's 7 states.
7 states.
The upper basin, lower basin. And the truth is, we, because of the Colorado River Authority, which we stood up in the legislation that I sponsored, we are now leading the charge in terms of our ability to manage the conversation. And it's going to play to our advantage as a state in a really significant way. And I say this tongue in cheek, but we were going into a bar fight with one arm tied behind our back. Yeah. And now we're the biggest guy in the fight.
Yeah. And we need to be. I think we got to be able to fight for this piece of it, because it is really going to be important to development. Not only just the water, but also energy. I think those 2 things are inextricably tied together, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah. But on energy, here's what's interesting. There is an agenda in Washington to completely change the energy strategy for our country. And it is not a good one.
It's not a good one. We're not doing well.
We're not. We have the ability as a country to be energy independent, but there's an agenda. Biden's been part of it. He shut down domestic oil and gas production in so many different ways. And we're now dependent as a country on our enemies and other countries to supply energy for America and for Utah. And Utah is such a big player and can be a big player in this. But it's even worse than that. We had, because Biden couldn't pass his agenda legislatively through the EPA, he waded into Utah in the last couple of years and basically was going to force shutting down 2 of our coal-fired power plants much, much earlier than we could afford, we were planning on. And it was going to have dramatic impacts on the lives of every Utahn.
Especially Dixie Power, by the way. If you're in southern Utah and Dixie Power, the coal plants that keep their power bills low.
And so our power bills were going to go up significantly, and our power was going to be less reliable. And myself and President Adams and Governor Cox said, enough is enough. We're going to sue the EPA. And we had a significant win in the courts in August of last year. And because of that, and because our willingness to go fight the EPA, your power is going to be affordable still and reliable still. But we've got, it's
just one round of the fight though. It's just one round. Yeah. And we got to, knowing that round has been won by us, that's great. That's great momentum, but we got to elect people in that is willing to keep going round for round on some of these fights.
That's what I was going to say. We've got to keep fighting. But even more importantly, let's send some folks back to Washington that are going to fix this dialogue. I'm an all of the above energy strategy person. I think nuclear is the future of energy in this country. We've got to fix and get rid of all the red tape around nuclear. Other countries can bring a nuclear power plant online so much faster than we can. Yeah. And no one needs it more than us. So we're our own worst enemy, and we've got to fix that. But in the meantime, by adopting the energy strategy that's being put upon us by the Biden administration and this leftist agenda, we're really hurting Americans' independence, our security as a country, and we're giving power to China. It's plain and simple. We're giving power to China. So we can't give up any ground on this right now.
Yeah. Energy is getting skewed into a conversation around climate. Do you think it has something to do with all the eggs we put into the UN? Do you think the UN and this global ideal around energy is hindering us? It's going all the way from that global idea all the way to the local level. Do you think that's part of it, or is that a conspiracy theory? Like, because it's hard to. I think
there's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah,
there is an agenda, and I think we've allowed others. The American people are getting frustrated, rightfully so. We want to be a meaningful contributor to the global economy and global challenges and issues, but when we start to allow organizations that do not necessarily have the United States' best interest at heart to dictate policies for the United States of America, whether it's the UN, whether it's the World Health Organization, whether it's others, we've lost our way as a country. And we've got that happening right now in this country. And
I would agree.
So I'm not an isolationist. Some are, but my gosh, we have got to do better. And,
what's your take on trade?
Yeah. Well, it's a big shift, but
I know that was a abrupt shift. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
In my mind, it like made all the sense, all those things, because energy and this global version of policy, right? Which it's like this catch-all. I think trade ends up looping into this. Yeah. And because typically economic ties keep us from getting into wars. Mm-hmm. And I actually believe that. I think building economic ties within countries allows for diplomacy to happen and not shooting each other, right? As soon as that economic and diplomacy things fail, that's when we start fighting. And that's when we start blowing each other up. Yeah. And we're seeing this groundswell of wars that are continuing to pop up. And so I can't help but think that they're kind of linked together. Yeah. So that's where it was in my head.
Well, I know I can definitely connect the dots, and I'm going to connect another dot too. I think that part of the reason why we've got so many global conflicts right now is America is not demonstrating strong leadership. And if we were, you'd see less of these foreign dictators and enemies being willing to stand up and do some of the things they're doing. But they view the White House as weak, and because of that, they're doing these aggressive actions across the globe, and we're paying the price for it. But in terms of trade, in general, I'm a free trade. I believe in free trade. But here's the problem. We talk about enemies. We were just talking about them. And they use trade as a weapon against the United States to weaken us. And we can't let that to happen. And so there are things that are in the best interest of our national security, whether it's energy, whether it's our food security, whether it's some of these industries where our enemies know that if they weaken an industry in the United States, they weaken us as a country. And so they use trade as a weapon. We can't let that happen. We saw President Trump, when he was president, realize that was happening, and he stood up to some of our enemies around trade issues, and we're better off because of it. So it's a fine line. We can't use trade and trade policies to protect and just create special interests for certain industries to enrich them. I'm not a fan of that.
Okay.
But we have to make sure we're not playing into the playbook of our enemies in so many different ways.
Do you think that's a second order consequence, though? No, like I can imagine there's some ways to keep that from happening, but most people are driven by self-interest. Yeah. I think everybody's driven by self-interest. I think anybody who's denying that is denying human nature at some capacity. And so, thinking about one industry versus another, it gets really difficult, especially when you're talking about so many economic sectors, right? Whether, we're trading specifically, computer chips, or we're talking about natural gas, right? Like thinking of all these different industries where trade has to exist. I'm definitely for open trade, like an open market of trade. Free trade to me sounds like a really great platitude. It sounds really good. Sure. But is that really supply and demand limits freedom, right? Just in its own right? And so how do we encourage some countries are going to be really great at producing something, and other countries are going to be better at producing other things, right? And so it's a really complex system in general. So I guess that self-interest piece of it seems really, it's like a big battle.
Super hard.
Yeah, it's super hard. And I think we're probably only the second or third probably the second generation that world trade even really exists at the capacity that it does now, right?
Yeah.
There's a book Thomas Friedman wrote. It's called The World is Flat, and how basically the internet and trade open the door for real free trade across the globe, right? This ability that, Madagascar can trade with any country in the world, right? And they have all the tools to be able to do that, where just a generation ago, they didn't have that tool. Like 1980, they couldn't do that necessarily. So we're kind of dealing with a set of cards that we're learning as we go, right?
I think that's true. There's another book I read earlier this year, actually last year, that it's got a scary title, but it talks about this issue. And it's a book called The End of the World is Just Beginning.
Interesting. Okay.
And it talks about trade.
Yeah.
And two things that stood out to me in this book, and I think it's completely accurate. One is that the reason the world economy has been able to be so successful over the last 50 years is for one reason. And it's the United States has kept the world a safe place and kept our seas free so that goods can be transported around the world.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We have lost our way as a country, and our Navy is not what it used to be. And we see our global foes like China, who are standing up a Navy, and they're putting a lot more resources into it than we are. And if we don't make sure we mind this carefully and take care of this, our ability to see free trade, or trade, let's not call it free trade, but trade around the world through the seas is really in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And here's the challenge with that. When you think about food security, when you think about energy security, there are so many countries. I mean, we're going to probably be okay here, right?
Yeah.
We're a big country. We've got a lot of natural resources. We do produce a lot of food. We need to be more careful about that. But there's a lot of countries that don't have the ability to produce any food, or hardly any energy. And if the world economy gets put on its knees because you can't trade across the seas, and we have problems that are a direct cause of the U.S. not being strong like it used to be, it's going to hurt our country, but it hurts others.
Yeah.
And the other part of the book is about demographics and the fact that we don't have as many kids as we used to. And, we have to be careful about that too, because one of the key things about the economy and quality of life is having a stable population, or a population that's growing.
Yeah.
And it's another reason why we want legal immigration in this country, so that our economy can continue to grow. But
that's our ace in the hole. For me, that's our as a country, as the United States goes, which is not true of most other nations. There's some nations that really could call themselves a melting pot. There's a few, but there's not really that many.
One of the few.
We're one of the few, and so that legal migration to this country is important. It's going to be a driving. It's going to be a driving leader in how we, spend the rest before the world fully ends.
And we need to,
as long as we don't nuke each other.
That's right. But China, they're going to see their population decline over the next 3 to 4 decades because of population growth and the fertility rate. We don't have that problem as much here in the United States, but it's something we need to be thoughtful of.
Yeah, and it's something that could change. They have a neighbor that has lots of kids in India. And so, they could change those relationships in India, and they can allow migration in to help support. I know I've seen the arguments on both sides of the geography of China and how, it could not sustain itself. Peter Zion talks a lot about that and demographics. And at the end of the day, we need to worry less about what all these other countries are doing and focus on how do we right our ship? Where are the challenges that we're, systematically failing on.
Correct.
And we got a lot of things. I think there's a lot of things. Military, we spend a lot of money. I don't know how we can spend so much money and still not be as effective or as much of a deterrence as we should when we're spending the amount of money that we spend on Department of Defense.
We do, but the sad part about that
there's a lot of waste in there.
I'm sure, yes, for sure, but we're spending more on interest on the national debt than we are defending our country now. Which
I know.
crazy, right?
That's crazy.
Our spending habits in Washington have created an environment where our interest payment to other countries is more than we're spending on defending ourselves from those other countries. Think about that.
I know, man. It's crazy. And you're a finance guy, so I can't help my head. I lose an understanding of it. There's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have, but I have not read it.
You should please read it. Please read it. I'm begging you to read it
put it on
because
the
I want
list.
somebody to tell me that Griffin doesn't know what he's talking about, because it for sure sounds like he knows what he's talking about, and he has so much history on the Fed and the creation of money, and what printing money actually is versus adding zeros to a ledger, because you have a fiat currency versus an actual physical currency. Like, I can't help but think we're going down an uncharted territory with money, and how that $34 trillion in debt, like, how does that compound over time? And then how do we even get that under control? I just don't even, it's hard for me to even see a route out of that, aside from massive tax increases.
Yeah. Massive tax increases, mass inflation, or, meltdown of the American economy. But I'm an optimist. I think you have to be in business, to be in politics.
For sure.
But until
I like that you're an optimist.
Yeah.
I need more optimists in my life.
Well, I'm a realist too, though. And there's a lot of hard work ahead of us. And I do think that the next 6-ish years until the end of this decade are going to we will make a decision about the future of this country. We're at a precipice right now. And we're going to get past a point of no return soon. And we've got to get some people in Washington that are willing to elevate these issues and start to bring some people along. It is harder to get people to do things than it is to just stop things in Washington. We need to stop some stupid things from happening, for sure. But then we've got to lean in and solve some of these problems. And I think that's what the American people want. I think that's what Utahns want in their U.S. senators, are people that are going to go back and not just stop stupid things from happening, but also be at the table and solve problems, but do it in a way that reflects Utah's values. And I think we've got that opportunity.
I think so too. Jeff, do you want to jump in? I think we got time for one final question. Jeff, do you have one?
I think, this might be jumping back a little bit, but how specifically, Brad, for you, you were the Speaker of the House for 5 years, right?
Yep.
How did you manage that job and your home business? Do you just do a lot of delegating on both sides, or what did that look like for 5 years? Because that's, to me, as an outsider looking in, seems like a lot.
Well, such a good question, Jeff. Thank you. Part of when I think back about what I was able to accomplish while I was Speaker of the House, I think some really remarkable things. We were able to get the biggest tax cuts in the history of the state. We were able to get constitutional carry. We were able to get school choice. We took on and won in terms of challenging the federal government on a lot of different issues. And the list goes on and on. There are things that have kept Utah red, I think a ruby red state. And to do all of those things, I knew that I needed to have the best team in terms of both a leadership team that worked shoulder to shoulder with me, but also staff that bought into that conservative vision. And so what we did at the Capitol is we would coalesce every year around an agenda that and I would do that very deliberately. Here's the things we know matter the most. It is so easy in politics to get caught up in the issues of the day. And for sure, you want to address the hot button topics. But if you allow that to drive your whole agenda, you're not paying attention to the big issues, the big gear issues that matter the most. And so my strategy as the leader of the House of Representatives was to bring on board people that would help me accomplish that agenda. And then we were just relentless at focusing on making sure we got those things done. And I am a very good delegator, but I think you can only be a good delegator if you are crystal clear about the objectives. And that's the way that I run my business too. I actually ended up hiring someone to run the day-to-day there. But there's a lot of clarity about what the business is supposed to accomplish. And then I would just check in and make sure we were still on track to make that happen. And interestingly enough, like you think about what I just described about tremendous clarity about where you want to go and what matters the most and the big levers, the big gears. We need more of that in our leaders in Washington that are really going to focus on the hard things. Sometimes, by the way, they're not the most exciting things, right?
Yeah.
They're not.
Politics should not be exciting in my perspective. It should be boring. We should be talking about boring things, right?
And so I agree. I mean, there's always problems that you need to solve, the issues of the day, but we really need to be thinking about 10, 20, 30 years from now and how we're going to solve the problems of tomorrow and pull the solutions into today, because the hard things always take time to figure out and solve. Mm-hmm. And I love that kind of work, actually.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That was a quick answer. On that. I'm going to just double click on as a developer, because that was your primary business previously, right? Or like a home builder?
As a home builder, yeah. Home builder, yeah.
So just to dovetail, I think we might have enough time we're going to just touch on this topic. My perspective is that the government is the affordable housing that is affordable, attainable housing, like we call them all these different euphemisms, right? There's three levers that I understand is what makes something, as far as a house goes, affordable. There's the median price of the home, there's the interest rate, and then there's the wages that the person makes, right? Those three things are what makes up whether something's a house is affordable or not. In my mind, the state government can't control or shouldn't be controlling two of the three. Correct. And the Fed already kind of indirectly impacts the mortgage rate. And it's a national mortgage rate, right? We don't have regional ones. The system's not set up that way. So we can't impact the interest rate. We can touch on median price of the home and wages. Median price of the home is what the market is driven. So what a seller's willing to sell it for and a buyer's willing to buy it for. That's median price, right? So then the last thing is wages. But I keep seeing legislation, or whether it's rules coming down from the state level, even to the local, but even sometimes in the local capacities, where they are going to try and solve the affordability problem when two out of the three, levers that actually are going to impact that are completely out of their control. And when it comes to wages, what exactly can you do when it comes to wages aside from raising the minimum wage? And we already know that doesn't impact what we think is going to impact, right? So what do we do?
So I will maybe answer your question a little bit differently, but I think I'll get there. There's a couple things that you can do to help people get into housing, right? Okay. And I think the first is on the wages side, just have a good economy. Have an economy where government stays out of the way of business, that believes in low taxes, and that attracts and fosters an environment where businesses can grow and be created and want to be here, so you have good paying jobs. Okay. That's how you deal with wages. Mm-hmm. On the housing price side, it's supply and demand. And government does have a role there. And the role government has is to do everything it can to let the market be the market and provide the supply that the market is demanding. And that is at the local level for the most part. And local government can be a real enabler of market-based solutions, or it can really stifle them. And I do think, in general, local government in this state has come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years of really understanding that the housing crisis in this country, but in particular in Utah, is hurting our kids. And so they want to be a solution to that. I mean, you see the state coming in and saying, yeah, you've got to have a housing affordability plan, and you've got to do the things you need to do. But the state can't really, at the end of the day, control that. They can just encourage the right behavior from local government. But local government can make all the difference. I mean, I have story after story of great examples of where cities would say, yeah, we really want to help get supply fixed in our community, and they would get out of the way within reason. and examples where they wouldn't, right? And so, but by and large, 8 out of 10 cities, I think, are doing a great job right now and helping with the supply side. But do
you think that the most impactful thing that the cities can do, or even the state, is saying, hey, there's some reform that needs to be done on zoning and understanding a roadmap, right? We're talking about like, what are the big gears that can move?
Yeah.
It seems to me that zoning is the main driver of allowing the market to add supply.
Yeah.
But if we give all these limits to what a developer can put on that piece of property, because it's not even like a developer. Most people are just like regular homeowners, right? Or just they own a piece of property, and they're not really doing this for a living, but they want to put something there that can make them, some money.
Yeah, I mean, and the market will ultimately solve for this if you allow it to within some reason. But what cities can do is they can have a really good plan of where they're going to have the kind of housing mix that their residents are going to need. And lots of different types of housing types throughout their municipality. And, you've got a lot of great leaders down here. Mayor Staley in Washington is one of them. I mean, Washington is going to be a really, really big city.
It is. That's their plan.
Shout out to our friend Jordan Hess there in Washington City.
Jordan Hess and all of the city council members that came on the show too.
And has the ability to be a big city if we solve for water.
Yep.
But they've got a plan of how do we get housing types for everyone.
Yeah.
And that they're a great example and leader in that regard.
I think they're taking an, I don't know if it's an unfair share, but if you look at the different cities, I think Washington has done a better job over the last 5 years in adding real supply at all of the price points. If you're comparing all the cities, St. George is probably pretty close there, but Washington really has taken the adding units, right? Dwellings, doors, places that people can sleep. Whether it's they have big houses there, but they have a lot of units that are smaller and apartments, and I think that's important.
Homes.
They got a whole range.
Rob, we've run out of time.
We're out of time. Son of a nutcracker.
That's good.
All right.
Well, it's been fun.
It always goes by way too fast.
It always goes by too fast. I hope to have you back on. I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
I know there's a big field out there, but you're going for the caucus vote, right? Are you going to gather signatures as well?
We're doing both.
You're doing both. Okay.
Yeah. Just kind of like Mike did, actually. Senator Lee did.
Yeah. It seems like that's kind of the direction.
That's the way most people do it.
Yeah, you're having to go that way. So thanks for coming on the show. Good luck, man.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time.
It's been really fun.
We'll see you out there, man.
Take care.